Imagine catching your boyfriend of 7 years cheating, sending him a furious breakup text, and realizing you just sent it to a literal mafia boss. That's exactly what happened to Lena Carter. After sitting in a hospital for 14 hours with her sick mother, she found a photo of her boyfriend in a hotel room with another woman. Blinded by tequila and rage, she texted, "I hope you rot," to a completely wrong number. The reply she got made her blood run cold. The stranger knew her name, knew where her cheating ex was, and had already dispatched his men to handle him.
Examine the physical manifestations of acute psychogenic shock. Lena Carter exhibited severe tremors, her motor functions compromised by 3 measures of low-quality agave liquor. Her visual presentation mirrored the sudden shattering of her 7-year psychological baseline. She transmitted a text message born of profound emotional dysregulation. "I hope you rot." The immediate reply, however, did not originate from her partner. It came from an unidentified number. This singular error would plunge her into a behavioral ecosystem far darker than she could comprehend. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case together. Before we examine the pathology of betrayal and obsession, if you find this clinical dissection fascinating, please subscribe and engage with the material. Take a moment to interact with the subscription mechanism, activate notifications, and leave a comment indicating your geographic location tonight. I study how these behavioral case files propagate across different regions. Now, prepare your coffee and let us dissect the subject. The initial sensory trigger for Lena was olfactory. The scent occupying the domestic space was not her partner Marcus's typical cologne, the one procured from a boutique on Madison Avenue. This was sweeter, a floral profile. The specific signature a male subject inadvertently collects when pressed into close physical proximity with a secondary female subject. Lena remained paralyzed in the bedroom doorway, still clutching the evening meal she had acquired in transit, trapped in a state of sensory denial. The meal was orange chicken, his preferred sustenance. She remained stationary, experiencing profound cognitive dissonance. Her conscious mind was finally processing the behavioral anomalies her subconscious had suppressed for months. She called out his name, her vocal cords constrained by adrenaline. From the adjacent bathroom, Marcus responded casually, over the sound of running water, humming a Stevie Wonder melody with complete ignorance of his impending psychological exposure. The thermal energy of the food container dissipated into her palm as she executed an action she had avoided for 7 years. She seized his cellular device. It rested on the furniture, entirely unsecured. Marcus possessed the arrogant pathologies of a narcissist, believing his deception was totally invisible. The digital evidence was immediate and undeniable. A contact designated as Brianna, accompanied by affectionately themed visual icons. A photographic preview materialized, and as her autonomic nervous system hijacked her motor control, she opened the image. The psychological floor dropped beneath her. The photograph depicted Marcus in an unidentified hotel environment, resting against white linens, exhibiting the asymmetrical facial expression Lena previously believed was reserved exclusively for her. The metadata indicated Tuesday. That identical Tuesday, Lena had endured 14 hours of severe psychological distress in a medical facility, physically supporting her critically ill mother. Marcus had claimed he was detained by professional obligations, fabricating an elaborate alibi. The subject had explicitly stated he experienced exhaustion and slept at his corporate workstation. A calculated deception. The auditory stimuli of the shower ceased. She registered the friction of the towel against his skin, accompanied by the persistent humming. Lena experienced such severe acute stress she nearly dropped the device. Demonstrating remarkable impulse control, she replaced it in its precise original orientation. She relocated to the culinary preparation area, deposited the food container, and anchored both hands against the stone surface to regulate her respiratory system. Marcus entered the space wearing casual attire, completely blind to the atmospheric shift. He praised the aroma of the food, profoundly unaware that his constructed reality had just been annihilated. Without establishing visual contact, Lena initiated the confrontation. She inquired about the identity of Brianna. The ensuing silence was a textbook manifestation of a predator caught outside their controlled environment. You might be wondering the same thing I did. How does the narcissist recalibrate? I count these reactions during interviews. 1, 2, 3 seconds. She reiterated the inquiry, finally turning to observe him. She specified the photographic evidence from the hotel room. Marcus displayed a micro-expression familiar to any clinical observer studying deceptive personalities. It was the rapid internal calculation of a manipulative subject assessing damage control. Rather than address the accusation, he aggressively deflected, weaponizing her breach of his digital privacy. Lena experienced a localized vocal cord failure, a crack in her delivery she deeply resented. She verbalized the stark contrast of their realities. Her 14-hour vigil at a medical facility watching intubation procedures versus his recreational infidelity. Marcus attempted to deploy standard pacification techniques, urging her to lower her volume. This instruction triggered a massive release of suppressed hostility. Lena, historically conditioned to be the compliant, emotionally regulated partner, found herself screaming with feral intensity. She weaponized the duration of their 7-year bond, contrasting it against her mother's suffering. Marcus predictably deployed the statistically common, intellectually vacant defense of the guilty, insisting her perception was totally flawed. As an observer of human pathology, you and I can recognize this critical juncture. Lena analyzed her partner attempting to construct a viable narrative fabrication in real time, ultimately failing. In that precise moment, she experienced absolute clarity, recognizing the permanent trauma inflicted upon her psyche. She demanded his immediate evacuation from the premises. Despite his weak attempts to assert territorial rights over the lease, she remained inflexible. He departed at roughly 9:30 in the evening, gathering minimal possessions and a timepiece she had previously gifted him. His attempt at a farewell physical embrace was met with rigid avoidance. She perceived him not as a partner, but as a dangerous, unknown entity. The baseline of their domestic reality was eradicated. The auditory finality of the locking mechanism echoed through the space. Lena collapsed onto the ceramic flooring, allowing the low temperature of the tiles to ground her sensory input. From her throat emerged an acoustic anomaly. It was neither a standard weeping response nor a vocalized scream. In psychiatric terms, it was the primal frequency of profound isolation, the acoustic manifestation of realizing one has been participating in a unilateral psychological partnership for years. She remained in this catatonic posture until her phone interrupted. Her closest associate, Jessica, announced her imminent arrival, having bypassed standard communication protocols due to intelligence gathered from Lena's sibling. The containment breach of Marcus's betrayal was already actively underway. Jessica Nguyen had served as Lena's primary emotional anchor since their early adolescence, displaying the aggressive protective instincts of a surrogate sibling. Jessica required no invitation to intervene. She breached the environment exactly 8 minutes later, armed with a premium bottle of Don Julio, frozen provisions, and the volatile kinetic energy of an individual validating years of negative behavioral profiling. She commanded the space, deploying the alcohol and demanding compliance. They executed a synchronous consumption of the toxic liquid. Jessica immediately initiated verbal hostility toward the departed subject, eager to confirm her long-held theories regarding Marcus's underlying pathological deficits and his historical disrespect toward Lena's familial structures. We can chart the predictable trajectory of chemical coping mechanisms. Following the third unit of alcohol, the subject's emotional dams fractured, resulting in weeping. By the fifth unit, inappropriate humor manifested, specifically targeting physical asymmetries in Marcus's cranial structure. Upon the seventh unit, a much darker pathology emerged. This was not the acute grief of betrayal, but the crystallized, dormant rage that accumulates when a victim subconsciously recognizes their captor's manipulation long before the conscious mind accepts it. Lena demanded direct communication with the abuser. Jessica, operating as the external rational governor, immediately prohibited the action, accurately citing Lena's severe cognitive impairment and the likelihood of post-event remorse. Lena articulated a fundamental truth of trauma retention. She expressed that failing to expel the verbal retaliation would result in permanent psychological scarring. She negotiated a compromise, the mere physical act of transcribing the hostility without executing transmission. Jessica observed the subject and conceded. Lena operated the digital interface with severely compromised fine motor skills. She drafted a manifesto of narcissistic injury. She labeled him a coward and a fabricator, wishing future partners would recognize his predatory camouflage. She documented the internal fracture he had caused, concluding with profound profanity and a desire for his biological decay. She stared at the toxic composition, her digit hovering dangerously over the mechanism of release. In the forensic analysis of this timeline, we pinpoint the exact fraction of a second where the trajectory of her life permanently altered. A gross motor failure of merely half an inch. Instead of the cancellation protocol, she engaged the transmission sequences. Jessica witnessed the digital payload deploy. A rapid exchange of panic ensued, with Lena citing mechanical error, while Jessica attempted rapid cognitive reframing, justifying the accidental transmission as a karmic necessity. However, Lena was no longer processing auditory input. Her visual cortex was locked onto the recipient data displayed above the hostile text. The designated target was unequivocally not the man who had systematically dismantled her psychological foundation. It was an anomaly she could not categorize. Stick with me. This is where the case file takes its darkest turn. The interface displayed an unassigned sequence of 10 numerical digits, a complete deviation from her established contact matrix. Lena verbalized the catastrophic error, informing her protector the hostility was misdirected. Jessica physically invaded Lena's personal space to verify the data, attempting to neutralize the escalating panic. She hypothesized the recipient was merely a random civilian, likely dormant, who would simply process and discard the erratic communication by morning. For approximately 11 seconds, Lena's neurobiology accepted this comforting rationalization. The illusion of safety persisted just long enough to drop her heart rate. Then the device vibrated. Both subjects froze entirely. The clinical file begins with a classic disruption of boundaries. Jessica, acting as the subject's rational anchor, repeatedly instructed Lena not to open the message, anticipating further narcissistic abuse from Marcus. But trauma victims often compulsively check for damage. Lena opened it. The text was highly methodical. "You have a beautiful rhythm when you type angry, almost musical." I assume this wasn't meant for me. Jessica immediately identified the behavioral anomaly, advising Lena to block the unknown number. Yet, beneath the alcohol and the emotional exhaustion, Lena experienced a primary autonomic fear response. A cold dread took root in her nervous system. Bypassing all logical defense mechanisms, her trembling fingers began to type a submissive apology. She wrote, "I am so sorry. Let us examine this moment closely because it is where the psychological trap springs shut." Lena sent the apology, explaining she was intoxicated and meant the text for her ex. Exactly 3 seconds later, the predator established dominance. "I do not forget much, Lena." The inclusion of her name triggered a respiratory freeze response. Jessica went into acute alarm, interrogating Lena about data exposure and demanding she block the contact immediately. Lena's thumb hovered over the screen. From a behavioral standpoint, the survival instinct should dictate immediate severing of contact. But the paralysis of the unknown took hold. She could never articulate why, not to her friend, nor to herself, but her thumb drifted away. She chose to engage the threat, engaging the anomalous variable. She asked how he knew her name. The response arrived with calculated speed, detailing an encounter from 3 weeks prior at a restaurant on 52nd Street. The suspect provided a flawless behavioral playback. Lena had been arguing with a man, bumped into the stranger, and apologized while calling herself a mess. He had responded with a highly calibrated, empathetic script. "Do not apologize. Messy nights are sometimes the honest ones." Reading this, Lena experienced acute parasympathetic withdrawal. Her mouth went entirely dry. The repressed memory surfaced with striking clarity. She recalled Marcus displaying public hostility, verbally degrading her clothing while intoxicated. She remembered the blind rush to escape the humiliation. The fragmented recall solidified. She remembered the tactile sensation of a dark coat and a voice offering an unexpected positive reinforcement. She recalled the urge to analyze his face, an impulse interrupted by Marcus physically controlling her movement by the sleeve. Turning to Jessica, Lena confessed she had indeed encountered this individual during a previous episode of domestic volatility. Jessica's logical processing short-circuited, questioning how a random physical collision resulted in a captured phone number. Before Lena could formulate the hypothesis, the screen illuminated with another chillingly observant command. "Breathe, Lena. I am not going to hurt you." The suspect demonstrated remote awareness of her physiological distress. Lena dropped the device instantly. Jessica reasserted her role as the protective surrogate, firmly declaring they would terminate the connection. But the incoming data stream escalated. The suspect transmitted a highly detailed tactical report. Marcus was currently in a parking facility on 41st Street with the female from the illicit photograph consuming alcohol and would attempt to operate a vehicle in 40 minutes. The stranger accurately predicted the narcissist's cyclical apology phase, explicitly instructing Lena to deny him entry. The clinical precision of the message induced a state of profound cognitive paralysis in both women. Jessica's tone shifted from authoritative to deeply apprehensive, asking what exactly Lena had triggered. Deep within Lena's traumatized psyche, a terrifyingly lucid question began to crystallize. How could an unverified variable predict the behavioral loop of her abuser with such exactitude? Operating under severe neurological stress, Lena typed a desperate inquiry for identification. "Who are you?" The suspect used a delayed response tactic. Nearly a minute elapsed, forcing the victim's anxiety to peak. Finally, the text arrived, framing his stalking as an act of vigilant protection. He claimed he had been monitoring her mistreatment for 3 weeks and his patience was depleting. He issued a directive to sleep and secure the premises, finishing with a classic psychological hook validating her emotional pain. The transmission ceased at 11:47 p.m. Precisely 37 minutes later, the predicted environmental stimulus occurred. Someone violently struck the door. The subject at the door was indeed Marcus. The auditory data confirmed profound intoxication and a clear sense of territorial entitlement, striking the barrier in aggressive clusters of 3. He demanded entry, using manipulative terms of endearment. Jessica intervened physically, dragging Lena away from the threshold to interrupt the habitual submission cycle. She recognized the microscopic facial cues, indicating Lena was preparing to yield to the abuser. Jessica aggressively reinforced reality. An anonymous individual had perfectly mapped Marcus's dangerous trajectory, and the prediction was flawlessly manifesting in real time. It was this realization, far more than the physical threat of the intoxicated narcissist demanding entry, that completely arrested Lena's motor functions. You and I must pause to appreciate the psychological weight of this moment. A faceless entity possessed a superior predictive model of her partner of 7 years than she did. From the hallway, Marcus attempted a common deception, claiming visual confirmation of her presence by citing a light in her window. It induced acute somatic distress in Lena, though Jessica rapidly dismantled the lie using spatial logic. The bedroom faced the alley, making observation impossible. Jessica instructed total inaction, relying on the standard extinction burst theory, assuming the subject would abandon the effort if deprived of a stimulus. However, the narcissist's need for control overrode his fatigue. Marcus escalated his volume, deploying weaponized apologies and demanding immediate visual access to his victim. The auditory assault began to fracture Lena's emotional containment. Jessica provided physical grounding therapy, enveloping her friend to muffle the intrusive noise. In the clinical file, we note the severe cognitive dissonance Lena experienced here. She struggled to reconcile the aggressive entity at her door with the man integrated into her family rituals. The man who had systematically deceived her for years. The vocalizations outside shifted from manipulative pleas to authoritative demands. The escalation generated genuine terror. Seeking structural intervention, Lena finally verbalized the possibility of contacting law enforcement. At that precise temporal marker, as if the digital device was actively monitoring their acoustic environment, the phone vibrated. Jessica commanded her to ignore it. Lena looked anyway. The incoming text demonstrated a frightening level of anticipatory intelligence. "Do not call the police. I have already sent someone. He will be gone in under 4 minutes. Stay away from the door." The implications of this message caused a catastrophic failure of Lena's motor control, dropping her to the hallway floor. She relayed the intervention parameters to Jessica, whose facial expression contorted into absolute incomprehension. The presence of an autonomous, uninvited protector crossed the threshold into extreme pathological danger. Jessica moved to physically confiscate the device, properly identifying the unfolding scenario as the precursor to a high-profile criminal tragedy. She explicitly referenced media depictions of missing women, attempting to break the hypnotic hold the stalker had established. Jessica accurately diagnosed the cognitive distortion occurring within Lena, warning her against romanticizing the intrusive behavior of an anomalous predator. But you and I must recognize the stalker's brilliance here. He had already established empirical credibility. Lena countered Jessica's panic with pure data. The stranger had possessed flawless foresight regarding Marcus's intoxication and arrival time. Jessica found herself entirely devoid of a rational counter-argument. The external environment remained volatile, with the narcissist loudly protesting his lack of compliance. Then the auditory data shifted abruptly. The shouting terminated mid-syllable. It was an unnatural cessation, indicating an immediate and overwhelming external pressure had been applied. Both subjects entered a state of hypervigilance. The acoustic profile in the corridor altered entirely. The erratic pacing was replaced by two distinct sets of heavy, deliberate footsteps. In behavioral analysis, a slow cadence in a high-tension scenario indicates apex dominance. These operatives felt zero environmental fear. A measured baritone voice addressed Marcus formally, initiating a forced extraction protocol. Marcus's response demonstrated immediate territory confusion. The operatives maintained chillingly polite syntax, calmly informing him they were escorting him to his vehicle. Marcus attempted to re-establish dominance through verbal resistance and an appeal to Lena. A brief physical altercation ensued. We hear a muffled vocalization and the controlled impact of mass against drywall, executed with the mechanical detachment of relocating a heavy object. When Marcus spoke again, his psychological profile had collapsed. The grandiosity was entirely purged, replaced by a rapid, submissive stutter. The enforcers directed him toward the exit with cold formality. The retreating audio painted a picture, one erratic, stumbling subject, being herded by two highly synchronized predators. The elevator machinery engaged, processed the payload, and departed, leaving an absolute acoustic void. Jessica, reduced to rudimentary motor functions by the sheer adrenaline dump, crawled to the barrier to verify the extraction. Before Lena could process the silence, the device vibrated. Let us review the stalker's closing transmission. He confirmed the target was secured in a vehicle and assured them a chemical or traumatic amnesia would prevent any subsequent identification. Absolute power. Let us examine the subject, Lena, in this precise moment of cognitive fracture. The digital message was clear. He will assume there was security from the building. Go to sleep, Lena. She stared at the screen, her normative inhibitions entirely stripped away by alcohol and acute emotional distress. She typed back,
Who are you?
A calculated pause preceded his response. Adrian Voss. Jessica, acting as her grounded anchor, recognized the threat profile immediately. Her survival instinct activated. Very quietly, Jessica asked for the laptop to execute a search. Lena complied, her motor functions visibly compromised by shock, handing over the device on legs that felt entirely disconnected. We often observe this somatic dissociation in subjects facing the initial onset of coercive control. Jessica initiated the digital search, and the footprint of a megalomaniac narcissist materialized immediately. The headlines painted the portrait of an apex predator operating with impunity. Voss family patriarch dead at 74. Son Adrian takes over family import business. Federal probe into Voss Holdings stalled for third year. The mystery man running New York's quietest empire. Jessica's facial micro-expressions broadcast pure terror, a biologically appropriate reaction to proximal danger. Lena leaned in to examine the fourth search result, a photograph. In that fraction of a second, an extreme autonomic drop occurred within her nervous system. Her entire body went completely cold. The face on the screen was not a stranger's. It was a face she already knew. Let us look closer at this initial point of contact, a classic premeditated insertion. She did not know him well. It was a brief, seemingly accidental encounter 3 weeks prior at a restaurant on 52nd Street. In a state of inebriated vulnerability, she had looked into a pair of cold, grey eyes, and he had delivered a perfectly calibrated line. Messy nights are sometimes the honest ones. Recognizing him now triggered a hysterical fugue state. She collapsed onto the floor beside her anchor, Jessica, covering her face as a volatile sound erupted from her throat, a violent collision between a laugh and a sob. The human psyche simply cannot process the realization that it has drawn the focused, obsessive fixation of a clinical psychopath. The psychological weight of her error began to crush her baseline reality. "I sent that message to a mafia boss," she whispered, her cognition fracturing under the stress. "He sent actual men to my building." Jessica, operating strictly from an uncompromised survival instinct, intervened with a pragmatic protocol for evasion. She took Lena's hands, attempting to re-establish a physical and emotional boundary. "You go to bed," Jessica instructed. "You drink a glass of water, call in sick, change your number, change your locks, and we pretend this never happened. It is the standard avoidance strategy." But as we know from studying criminal pathology, you cannot simply lock out a predator who has already begun mapping the internal architecture of your mind. Jessica offered the ultimate mammalian comfort, physical proximity, promising to carry Lena down the fire escape at the first sign of a physical breach. This elicited a genuine laugh from the subject, a momentary release of built-up cortisol. But isolation in the dark is where the megalomaniac's seed truly takes root. Lena lay in bed, her phone face down, stripped of all feelings of environmental safety. Hypervigilance completely consumed her auditory processing. She registered Jessica snoring softly, the radiator clanging, a car passing on the street. She obsessively catalogued every vibration, entirely unable to distinguish the normal sounds of her shelter from the footfalls of an encroaching hunter. The psychological incubator for the trauma bond was now active. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, the device vibrated, a digital tether pulling at her fraying sanity. 2 minutes later, another pulse. "Are you awake, Lena?" Her thumbs moved to reply before her prefrontal cortex could veto the action, an automatic compliance response. "Yes," she typed. His next question was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Are you all right?" He did not ask if the threat was neutralized or if his men had left. He asked about her emotional state, fabricating a sense of deep, personal care. "I do not know what I am," she confessed. He praised her honesty, then delivered the paralyzing blow. "You searched my name." He was actively establishing omniscience, the absolute cornerstone of a sophisticated captor's control. He rationalized his surveillance as a necessary survival mechanism, further mystifying his dangerous persona. "I imagine what you read was not flattering," he wrote, calmly admitting that the horrific allegations were mostly true, while promising to clarify the exaggerations later. Here, we witness the terrifying onset of Stockholm Syndrome. Despite the glaring empirical data presenting a lethal threat, a fractured piece of Lena's psyche, the damaged, neglected part that had just survived a traumatic separation, felt a spark of dark fascination. She felt seen. And you and I both know, feeling seen by a monster often feels better than being ignored by a lover. Hating herself for the impulse, she initiated further contact. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. His response outlined a textbook predatory stalking cycle disguised as romantic fate. He confessed to observing her 3 weeks prior, watching her apologize to a man who was verbally mistreating her. He recognized a prime victim profile: empathetic, submissive, highly compliant. He admitted to leveraging his illicit network to extract her identity, her residence, and her employment data. He claimed he had planned to maintain a disciplined distance, but framed her accidental text message as an unavoidable cosmic mandate. "I decided the universe had made a decision I was not willing to argue with." This is the classic displacement of responsibility utilized by malignant narcissists. They do not attack, they simply answer the universe's irresistible call. Lena correctly identified the profound pathology of his behavior, labeling it as the most insane thing anyone had ever said to her. He reframed the stalking with chilling semantics, calling it paying attention rather than watching. When she admitted she was paralyzed by the situation, he offered a false reprieve, promising her safety for the night and giving his absolute word. She tested the boundary, asking if his word held any empirical value. His reply was an exquisite example of coercive isolation. "To most people, no. To you, it will be." He was formally separating her from the rest of humanity, establishing a private ecosystem where only his twisted rules applied. She did not respond, but the psychological submission had already been meticulously secured. Let us track the physiological exhaustion that inevitably follows acute terror. Sometime near dawn, her adrenal glands entirely depleted, Lena finally collapsed into sleep. She regained consciousness at 10:47 to the normative sounds of Jessica preparing coffee. Her cellular device showed 11 missed calls from her former partner, Marcus, the original source of her distress. But the true psychological hook lay in a single, recent message from the criminal syndicate leader. "There is coffee at your door," it read. "Black, 1 sugar." The doorman accepted the delivery. "Do not be alarmed." This was an aggressive boundary violation disguised as an act of nurturing care, designed to demonstrate that physical barriers were entirely useless against him. The cognitive dissonance peaked as Lena begged Jessica to confirm the hallway was empty. Jessica returned holding the physical proof of his infiltration, a warm cup from an exclusive cafe bearing a small folded card. Jessica placed it on the counter with the extreme caution one might use when handling a live explosive. The threat was no longer digital. It had actively crossed the physical threshold of their sanctuary. With trembling fingers, Lena opened the card. In immaculate, highly controlled penmanship, the directive was clear. "Call in sick. Rest today," initialed simply with the letter A. It was not a polite suggestion. It was a behavioral command issued by a captor beginning to assume total, unquestioned authority over her daily routine. What happens next is a pivotal diagnostic marker of a developing trauma bond. Despite the overwhelming evidence of severe danger, Lena picked up the cup and consumed the beverage. It was prepared with exact, terrifying precision. Jessica observed this act of submission with deep, clinical dread. "I am going to say this one thing," Jessica warned her, acting as the final voice of rational preservation. "That man is not a man you can wade out into. He is a current. You put one toe in him, and he takes you out to sea." It was a profoundly accurate assessment of the megalomaniac's gravitational pull. Once the victim accepts the first offering, the psychological undertow begins to drag them far beyond the reach of conventional rescue. Jessica outlined the necessary protocol for survival: block the number, erase the identity, revert to the normative existence of a 29-year-old woman healing from a standard heartbreak. Lena verbally complied, assuring her friend she would execute the block. But Jessica had 17 years of baseline behavioral data on her friend. She recognized the microscopic indicators of deception immediately. The captor's grip was already firmer than their lifelong friendship. Without another word, Jessica confiscated the empty cup, discarded it in the waste bin, and gathered her overnight bag. The normative anchor was officially detaching, leaving the subject entirely isolated in the silent, waiting current of her terrifying new reality. The anchor leaves the environment. Jess, acting as the protective variable, exits with a threat of physical violence against the parasitic ex-boyfriend. The door clicks shut, and our subject, Lena, is entirely isolated. Let us examine this moment closely. She sits at the very same counter where she previously spiraled into a reactive state. Instead of reinforcing her boundaries, she engages with the apex predator. She opens the thread with Adrian Voss. Her thumb hovers over the block button, a desperate attempt at self-preservation, but the compulsion overrides it. She types a gesture of submission, a simple thank you. She does not hit send. She does not hit block. She remains paralyzed in a state of suspended trauma until the device rings in her hand. The incoming stimulus is the predator himself. 1 ring, 2, 3. On the fourth, her compliance takes over and she answers. The voice on the other end is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Low, measured, completely devoid of anxiety. Good morning, Lena. Notice the immediate physiological response in our subject. Her nervous system floods with cortisol. Her tongue goes flat. Her heart rate spikes into a frantic, unhelpful rhythm against her ribs. She is experiencing textbook hyperarousal. When he asks if she is there, she confirms. He asks about her sleep, already knowing the pathological anxiety kept her awake. When she asks why he is calling, there is a micro-expression of auditory amusement, a dark, calculated, almost law. We must observe how the megalomaniacal narcissist asserts dominance. He casually reveals he knows she was researching him at 3 in the morning. This omniscient posturing shatters her perceived privacy. She attempts to label him, calling him a mafia boss, trying to build a cognitive wall. He easily deflects, reframing his identity as a mere businessman with a memorable surname. It is a classic minimization tactic. Meanwhile, Lena is physically and psychologically compromised. Her body is entirely depleted, aching from what can only be described as the toxic synthesis of alcohol and profound regret. Her defenses are systematically breaking down. In this weakened, vulnerable state, she finally submits to the interrogation and admits she has something to tell him. You and I have seen this exact defense mechanism before. The subject attempts to establish a rigid boundary. She announces her intention to block his number, citing her friend as the moral authority. She offers a fragmented gesture of gratitude for removing the immediate threat of her ex-boyfriend, then attempts a final goodbye. But the narcissistic captor does not accept rejection. He merely pivots. His vocal register drops into a softer, hypnotic cadence. He issues a simple, undeniable directive. Look out the kitchen window. She attempts to resist, stating she refuses to play a psychological game, but he assures her it is real. Despite her intense self-loathing and awareness of the trap, her compliance is absolute. She physically obeys the command. She moves to the glass and observes her environment, which has now been entirely compromised. A black sedan idles menacingly on her quiet street, a glaring anomaly. Adrian clinically informs her that this vehicle intercepted her ex-boyfriend just 20 minutes prior. He is demonstrating absolute territorial control. He diagnoses Marcus perfectly. Not a lethal threat, but a stubborn, intoxicated variable that requires management. Notice the biological reaction in our subject. Her stomach physically recoils at the realization that she was hunted while completely unconscious. When she protests, stating clearly that she never consented to this extreme level of intervention, the predator simply agrees. He is establishing himself as her sole architect of safety. Here we witness the isolation phase of the megalomaniac. Lena lists her violated boundaries. The surveillance, the men in her hallway, the unwanted guardianship. His response is chillingly rational. He intervenes because her existing network is critically flawed. He systematically devalues her anchors. He weaponizes the trauma of her mother's illness and her ex-partner's infidelity. He clinically dismisses her best friend, noting that she ultimately abandons Lena at night. Then, he presents his own obsession as a profound devotion. He observed her face weeks ago and became permanently fixated. He renders her completely mute. He has effectively positioned himself as the ultimate, inescapable authority, leaving her paralyzed in the face of his overwhelming control. The manipulator executes a flawless illusion of autonomy. He gives her explicit permission to sever contact, assuring her he will maintain the protective perimeter for 3 days regardless. By reframing his obsessive stalking as a debt of honor, he completely neutralizes her defensive hostility. Then, he initiates the disconnect. He hangs up first, retaining absolute narrative power. Now, observe the subject's internal cognitive fracture. For the first time, Lena cannot calculate her primary threat. Is it the parasitic ex who subjected her to chronic deceit, or the apex predator who just orchestrated a masterclass in psychological capture? The trauma bond takes root. In an act of profound self-sabotage and emerging Stockholm Syndrome, she leaves the channel open. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The subject's behavioral loop begins to dramatically shift. Her primary anchor, Jessica, initiates intense contact, instinctively sensing danger. By the fifth interrogation, Lena begins actively constructing an alternate reality. Utilizing the careful, flat affect of a woman rehearsing a fabrication, she explicitly lies to her protector. She claims the predator's access has been severed and that she is perfectly safe. When the friend detects the psychological dissonance, noting her strange vocal tone, Lena utilizes her physical hangover as a convenient smokescreen. The lie instantly begins to fester within her nervous system. She has officially begun isolating herself to protect the very dynamic that is hunting her. The secondary antagonist re-enters the field. The ex-boyfriend transmits a desperate plea, demanding a 10-minute physical encounter in a controlled public environment. Our subject reads the data and emits a dry, humorless physiological response. She possesses 7 years of baseline behavioral data on this man. She recognizes his pathology perfectly. He operates on sheer emotional attrition. If denied access, he will escalate to relentless physical stalking at her residence, a pattern he previously demonstrated even against his own mother. Marcus Bell does not process the concept of a boundary. He views the word no merely as a temporary obstacle, applying continuous, suffocating pressure until the victim's psychological exhaustion forces them to surrender and comply. The subject attempts to assert a rigid parameter dictating the time and location while threatening immediate abandonment if he deviates by a single minute. The parasite instantly floods her with unearned affection, which she clinically ignores. Now observe the critical transfer of codependency. She debates engaging her healthy anchor, Jessica, but the cognitive dissonance prevents it. Instead, driven by a profound pathological need for a specialized guardian, her fingers move almost involuntarily. She transmits her entire itinerary to the megalomaniac. She formats the message as casual information, insisting she expects zero intervention. But the psychological reality is undeniable. She is actively seeking the protective umbrella of her new, vastly more dangerous captor. The predator's response is immediate, arriving in under 60 seconds, a single, perfectly calibrated validation. "Thank you for telling me." He offers no threats, no commands, and in a terrifying display of how rapidly the trauma bond has formed, this minimal contact completely regulates her shattered nervous system. It stabilizes her more than any healthy interaction could. The subsequent hours are a dissociative blur. She exhibits classic depressive paralysis, staring at ceilings, consuming virtually no calories, completely emotionally unmoored. When the time arrives, she cloaks herself in neutral, desaturated clothing, a subconscious attempt to minimize her physical presence in the environment. She walks to the designated coordinates, sits by the glass, and prepares for the impact. Let us analyze the physical environment of this encounter. The lesser parasite arrives 8 minutes past the established boundary, immediately testing her resolve. He initiates a choreographed display of performative distress, damp hair, bloodshot eyes, and a physical posture mimicking absolute surrender. He attempts unauthorized physical contact, reaching for her hand to trigger their shared history. She instantly retracts, reinforcing the barrier, and activates the timer. On cue, he begins to weep. Historically, this exact emotional manipulation has been highly effective. She has always rushed to soothe his engineered suffering. But today, the neurological pathways that once triggered her empathy have been completely severed by a far superior predator. The subject observes his breakdown with profound emotional detachment, perceiving his tears as mere background noise happening to a complete stranger. She is no longer providing his necessary narcissistic supply. He launches into a frantic, chaotic defense narrative, aggressively devaluing his affair partner while attempting to weaponize his own fabricated loneliness. Our subject counters with raw, clinical data. While he was seeking external gratification, she was enduring a 14-hour medical trauma with her mother. He rapidly escalates his promises, offering therapy and religious intervention, desperately demanding she not abandon their extensive history. But her cognitive clarity is finally absolute. She clinically informs him that he alone incinerated their 7-year bond. In my clinical experience with volatile attachments, this specific shift is always alarming. Marcus dropped his face into his hands, sobbing, "I love you, Aki." Lena stood her ground, quietly telling him he did not understand what that word meant. When he looked up, the tears remained, but a microscopic recalibration had occurred. The desperate pleading morphed into hardened paranoia. "Who is he?" She blinked, disoriented. Marcus aggressively insisted there was another man. He claimed he saw 2 figures in her hallway the previous night, analyzing their movements with the hypervigilance of a threatened predator. They were not ordinary security, he told her. They did not move like guards. We must remember a simple truth. The desperate need to control always masquerades as wounded affection. So, Who is he, Aki? Her autonomic nervous system instantly registered the threat. Her pulse spiked, yet she maintained a perfectly neutral expression. There is no guy, Marcus, she replied. He accused her of lying. Lena leaned forward, dropping her vocal register to enforce a boundary. She explained that even if she had met someone 5 minutes after their breakup, it was no longer his concern. He forfeited those rights on Tuesday, do you understand? She asked. As a behavioral analyst, I see this pattern constantly. Challenging a fragile ego triggers an immediate rage response. His jaw locked, the victim persona evaporated, his features twisted into a cold cruelty. Echoing the night he ruthlessly berated a young waiter at Ambrosia until the boy trembled. Don't make me look stupid, Lena, he warned her. He demanded she not embarrass him, terrified of looking like a fool whose partner left him for a wealthy Manhattan elite. Marcus, this is over, Lena stated firmly. He rejected reality, but she calmly reminded him their relationship had ended on Tuesday. When she stood to leave, the physical escalation began. He grabbed her wrist, not with maximum force initially, but with enough pressure to enforce his physical dominance. She froze, staring at his fingers clamped around her arm in a busy coffee shop on Lexington Avenue at 6:14 p.m. She experienced a profound psychological detachment. The terrifying realization washed over her. The man she loved was a complete stranger. Sit down, Marcus commanded in a low, dangerous tone. She instructed him to release her. The barista nervously watched the crisis unfold. Bystander apathy is the documented sociological tragedy. A woman nearby watched. An elderly man with a newspaper observed from the corner. Yet, nobody intervened. Lena understood the silent rule of public conflict. When an aggressor asserts physical control, the crowd transforms into inanimate furniture. But there was a statistical anomaly in the room today. A hand descended onto Marcus's shoulder with a calculated, steady pressure. It belonged to a man in a charcoal overcoat. Sir, a profoundly mild voice instructed. Let go of the lady's arm. Marcus looked up, and his micro-expressions transitioned rapidly through 3 distinct stages. First, genuine confusion. Then, horrifying recognition. Finally, pure, unadulterated terror. He released her wristlet instantly, retreating as if her skin were on fire. Adrian Voss stood directly behind his chair. Adrian's appearance was immaculate and deeply intimidating. His dark hair was clipped with absolute precision. His eyes were a sterile, hollow gray, a clinical shade that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Displaying pure psychological dominance, he ignored Lena entirely, focusing his predatory gaze solely on Marcus. Mr. Bell, he commanded quietly, stand up. Marcus stammered, attempting to feign ignorance, but the pressure was absolute. Stand up, Mr. Bell. Marcus complied immediately, his autonomy stripped away in seconds. Adrian's vocal tone never fluctuated from its calm, hypnotic cadence. He systematically delivered his directives. Marcus was to leave the shop, turn left on Lexington, and walk 3 blocks without looking back. Every avenue of future contact was surgically severed. No phone calls, no text messages, and absolutely no visits. Are we clear? Adrian asked. Marcus tried to posture, but Adrian simply repeated the question with terrifying stillness. Are we clear, Mr. Bell? In forensic psychology, we call this the collapse of the false self. Lena watched it happen in real time. Her manipulative partner of 7 years, the man who weaponized his tears and physically intimidated others, regressed into a terrified child within a single sentence. Yeah, we are clear. Marcus stammered. He tried to offer a pathetic parting excuse, but a single look silenced him. Marcus walked out, utterly broken, and never looked back. The environmental tension slowly normalized. The barista resumed cleaning, and the passive bystanders buried their faces in their newspapers, pretending the psychological violence never occurred. Only then did Adrian Voss finally rotate his focus to examine Lena Carter. "Are you all right?" he inquired. Lena remained silent, caught in a dissociative state, staring at her wrist. 4 red abrasions were already forming, perfectly mapping the dimensions of Marcus's fingertips. Adrian's gaze followed hers, registering the physical trauma. What happened next is a classic interindicator of the megalomaniacal protector complex. A dangerous micro-expression flickered across his meticulously controlled features. It was a tremor of absolute violence, invisible to the untrained eye, but Lena caught it. In that fraction of a second, she witnessed the unmasked, lethal rage of Adrian Voss. It was a primeval warning, a manifestation of pure destruction that human instinct dictates you only want to encounter once. "I am fine," she deflected. He clinically noted that she was not. She quietly reminded him she had explicitly asked him not to intervene. He coldly countered that stating her locations was not the same as forbidding his presence. When she refused to sit, he decided they would walk. He placed a hand lightly against her lower back. In my field, unsolicited touch from a dominant individual usually triggers a fear response. He applied 0 kinetic force, no pushing, no pulling. The contact was merely an illusion of guidance. Yet Lena, recently assaulted by a partner of 7 years, realized this touch from a dangerous stranger did not elevate her panic. The psychological roots of trauma bonding often begin in these confusing moments of perceived safety. She found herself complying, following him down Lexington until a stealthy black sedan glided up beside them. "Get in," Adrian instructed. Her dormant survival instincts finally flared, and she vehemently refused to enter the vehicle with him. He subjected her to a prolonged, analytical stare. Breaking his cold baseline, a rare micro-expression of amusement surfaced. A fractional smile tugged at his mouth. "Smart girl," he validated, rewarding her self-preservation. "You and I must recognize this tactic. It is how apex controllers manufacture trust." He leaned into the sedan, murmured a quiet command to his driver, and dismissed the vehicle entirely. As the car vanished, Adrian recalibrated his approach. He offered to walk her home, giving his word he would attempt nothing more. Lena challenged this framework, questioning why he treated his word as if it held tangible currency. His response was chillingly pragmatic. "Because where I come from, Lena, it is the only thing that does." It was a subtle admission that he operated strictly by the unforgiving, violent honor code of the criminal underworld. They proceeded in silence for 2 blocks, allowing her nervous system to decompress. She finally verbalized her trauma without making eye contact. "He grabbed my wrist." Adrian calmly confirmed he saw it. She expressed disbelief over the bystander apathy, admitting she had never been physically intimidated before. His responses remained mathematically steady. She pressed the timeline, realizing the terrifying implications of his rescue. "You were in the shop the whole time." Adrian confessed to conducting active surveillance, simply waiting for Marcus to cross an unacceptable threshold. "That is completely insane," she told him. His lack of denial was striking. "Yes," he agreed without hesitation. The psychological absurdity of his predatory protection triggered a paradoxical, helpless laugh from Lena, a very common involuntary tension release mechanism we observe in captive subjects. "I do not know what you want from me," she confessed. Adrian stopped, turning to face her. He placed his hands in his overcoat pockets, assessing her with a cold, detached curiosity. It was the gaze of a predator evaluating a wounded creature, calculating the burden of ownership. "I do not want anything from you," he stated, employing a masterclass in psychological disorientation. He systematically listed his non-demands: no dates, no physical intimacy, no debts owed. His stated objective was purely her safety, promising to vanish once achieved. This is the savior complex weaponized to its highest degree. Lena, retaining a fraction of her logical defenses, boldly declared she did not believe him. She understood that in human behavior, absolute altruism is usually a mask. "That is all right," he replied, remaining entirely unfazed by her cognitive resistance. He validated her skepticism, admitting her distrust was wise. "Then what are you doing?" she challenged. His silence was heavy, loaded with a violent history. "I am trying to find out whether I am still a man who can want something without taking it," he confessed. He admitted he had not been tested on that impulse in years, and she was the active variable. This admission of predatory desire, dressed as restraint, completely paralyzed Lena. They completed the journey to her building in absolute silence. Upon arrival, he maintained a calculated physical boundary at the corner, projecting the image of a perfectly disciplined guardian. He issued 3 strict commands: go inside, lock the door, and sleep. He guaranteed Marcus was neutralized. She thanked him, and they exchanged brief, formalized goodbyes. The psychological trap was now flawlessly, irreversibly set. Following his directives like a conditioned subject, she navigated her building, entered her apartment, and secured the deadbolt. Shedding her coat, she collapsed onto the floor, pressing her spine against the barrier of the front door. Burying her face in her hands, she attempted to reconstruct her baseline reality from merely 48 hours prior. The cognitive dissonance was too severe. Her previous life had been entirely overwritten. Suddenly, the vibration of her phone shattered the silence. A message illuminated the screen. "I forgot to ask, did you eat today?" The juxtaposition of a ruthless enforcer demonstrating domestic care broke her emotional regulation. She laughed into the void of her living room, transitioned into hysterical weeping, and then laughed once more. Her fingers, disturbingly steady, drafted a willing response to her psychological architect. She transmitted a negative response. A calculated pause followed before his reply. He informed her that a paper bag rested outside her door, containing a turkey sandwich. His final instruction was an explicit boundary test. Do not open the door until the footsteps retreat. Almost instantaneously, heavy, deliberate footsteps approached down her corridor, halting directly on the other side of her door. No knocking, no verbal communication, just the muffled impact of a bag making contact with the carpet. The footsteps retreated, followed by the mechanical chime of the departing elevator. Lena sat immobilized, clutching the device to her chest. In that profound silence, the trauma bond fully crystallized. She recognized with absolute clarity that she had willingly crossed into a psychological labyrinth, and the woman she was just 2 days ago was officially, permanently deceased. Let us open the psychiatric file on Lena Carter. She stood at her kitchen counter, consuming the sandwich left by Adrian Voss. In behavioral analysis, we observe that victims often refuse to sit when experiencing severe cognitive dissonance. The physical tension mirrors their internal chaos. The bread was fresh, the turkey thick, the pickle meticulously wrapped. This is classic grooming. The narcissistic predator anticipates needs to foster early dependency. Lena's internal monologue fractured. She thought she was losing her mind, then immediately praised the food. Her phone rang. Jessica Nguyen. "Lee, do not greet me. Open the door. I am in your hallway. Lena nearly choked. The predator's gift had been violently interrupted by reality. She wiped her mouth, a primal gesture of guilt, and rushed to open the door. Jessica Nguyen stood there, grocery bag in hand, her gaze locked onto Adrian's paper bag. Jessica's expression was an absolute study in environmental rejection, the fiercest, most clinically unimpressed look a human could muster. "Let me explain," Lena pleaded. Jessica, functioning as her psychological anchor, offered to listen over a bottle of wine. She set her bag down, crossed her arms, and established a physical barrier. "You told me you blocked him," Jessica stated, cutting through the self-deception. "I know," Lena replied, her defense mechanisms crumbling completely. "I lied to you." We see this often. The subject begins to isolate herself to protect the captor. "I lied to you, and I am deeply sorry." Jessica closed her eyes, self-regulating her own frustration before demanding the complete timeline. Lena recounted the behavioral sequence. The text message, the coffee shop, Marcus exhibiting erratic emotional dysregulation, the physical aggression, and Adrian's calculated intervention. Halfway through this debriefing, Jessica sat down. By the end, she had buried her face in her hands, recognizing the predator's psychological footprint. "He stood there the entire time," Jessica observed. "He watched your ex-partner escalate physical control before he intervened." Lena paused. The cognitive blind spot had successfully shielded her from this detail. She simply had not analyzed the timeline of the assault. Jessica was actively dismantling the romanticized narrative. "I am trying to show you the objective reality of this situation," she explained. A psychologically healthy individual would have de-escalated the threat immediately. Instead, Adrian allowed the aggression to unfold. He required a contrast. He needed Marcus to play the volatile abuser so he could step in as the highly regulated savior. This is not happenstance. It is meticulously choreographed behavioral manipulation. Lena stood paralyzed as the reality of the megalomaniac narcissist tactic set in. Jessica looked at her with profound, exhausted familiarity. "Sit down," she instructed. "Now I will ask a question, and I require total clinical honesty. Do not attempt to deflect." "Do you like him?" Jessica asked, piercing the psychological fog. Lena attempted to deflect, citing the acute timeline of her 48-hour breakup with Marcus. But Jessica was evaluating the trauma bond, not her readiness for a new relationship. Lena hesitated, her facial micro-expressions betraying her confusion. "I do not know," she finally admitted. "There is an inexplicable draw. He is entirely regulated, Jessica. When he speaks, the chaotic stimuli of the world completely cease. You and I see this frequently in clinical settings. The victim mistakes a predator's sociopathic lack of anxiety for genuine safety." "I know exactly how this sounds," Lena confessed, fully aware of the psychological trap she was willingly stepping into. "I am not a fool," Lena insisted, demonstrating the classic defensive posture of a vulnerable subject. "You are a heartbroken woman currently targeted by a highly dangerous individual." Jessica countered, correctly identifying that trauma and attention create victims, not fools. Lena let out a fractured laugh. "But he told me his word possesses value," she argued. "He claimed he wants to test if he can desire an object without forcefully extracting it." Jessica stared, processing the absolute audacity of the narcissistic script. "He said that?" In those exact words, Jessica rubbed her face, overwhelmed. "Lena, that is either unprecedented vulnerability or the absolute most lethal psychological conditioning I have ever witnessed in this city." "I do not know which it is," Lena admitted, trapped in the cognitive dissonance that precedes Stockholm Syndrome. They remained suspended in that tense environment. The wine, the half-eaten sandwich, the paper bag of grooming evidence untouched by Jessica. Finally, Jessica breached the physical space and took Lena's hand. "This is the protocol we will follow," she declared. "I will not demand you block his access. That boundary has already collapsed, but you must implement risk management, decelerate the interaction. No isolated vehicles, no private residences. If he summons you, the environment must be public, illuminated by daylight, in locations I have personally vetted. And you will report every single movement to me, without exception." Jessica required verbal confirmation of the safety parameters. Public, daylight, vetted locations, constant reporting. Lena repeated the protocol. "Are you experiencing anger toward me?" Lena asked, seeking emotional reassurance. "No," Jessica replied. "I am terrified of the psychological destination you are accelerating toward." Lena offered no rebuttal. She merely held her anchor's hand. They relied on pizza and wine to self-medicate the acute anxiety. Jessica succumbed to exhaustion. By 11, Lena retreated to her bedroom, her device charging on the nightstand. She stared into the dark ceiling, resisting the urge to initiate contact. Adrian Voss remained completely silent, not that evening, not the next morning, nor for 3 entire days. Sometime during the second day of the enforced silence, Lena experienced a horrifying internal revelation. She was experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. She missed him. The attachment to Marcus had been entirely severed. Blocking his calls evoked zero emotional resonance. But the dormant device, the suspended conversation with Adrian, consumed her psychological bandwidth. She monitored the screen obsessively. With every instance of a blank display, her physiological distress compounded. By the third day, the internal shame was palpable. You and I must recognize the simple life lesson here. True freedom is not merely escaping an abuser, but recognizing the quiet, comfortable chains we willingly hand to the very next predator. She attempted to utilize logic to override the emotional hijacking. "You are 29, she reminded herself. "You possess real estate, a career, familial obligations, and a stable life. You cannot be paralyzed by the absence of a predator's digital communication." She engaged in mundane grounding exercises, laundry, grocery shopping, painting her nails. Yet, the compulsive checking persisted. Finally, on the 4th evening at 7:42, the dopamine hit arrived. The device buzzed. "How are you, Lena?" She allowed 60 seconds to pass before engaging. I am functional," she replied. "How are you?" His response was a calculated microdose of validation. "Better now." Lena rested her head against the cold counter, laughing at his absolute control. God help her, the behavioral conditioning was flawless. She initiated the next phase, asking if he was in the city and available for coffee. The subsequent silence was a deliberate extension of tension. "Lena," he finally replied, "is that a wise course of action? The manipulation here is profound. The narcissist forces the victim to take ownership of the risk." "You are asking me," she typed back, "because if you ask me, I am forced to lie." A fascinating display of mutual self-awareness. "Yes," she confirmed. "Tomorrow at 4, the Lexington location. I am bringing my defensive anchor. She will be hostile." "That is mathematically fair," he conceded. Noting he had endured worse, the appointment was set, the trap slowly closing around them both. Lena drifted toward the hallway mirror, initiating a session of profound self-evaluation. She clinically observed the 2 distinct identities fracturing within her. There was the woman from 5 days prior, anchored to a predictable routine and a flawed partner. Then there was the current subject, accelerating toward a highly volatile variable. Analyzing her reflection, she could not determine which iteration of herself presented the greater threat. She dialed Jessica to activate the safety protocol. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, the two women entered the Lexington establishment. Adrian Voss was positioned in the tactical corner. Dark coat, black coffee. He rose. A performative display that triggered Jessica's defensive posture immediately. "Miss Nguyen," Adrian stated, extending his hand in a calculated offering of diplomacy. Thank you for your presence." Jessica maintained her physical boundaries, rejecting the handshake entirely. "Sit down," she commanded. You and I must note how she deliberately refused his resources, ordering absolutely nothing. "I am going to interrogate you," she warned. "I will be hostile." Adrian calmly invited the aggression. "What is your objective with my associate?" Jessica demanded. "I am ensuring her psychological stability," he replied. "Why? Because she intrigues me." "You possess no data on her," Jessica countered. "You utilized search engines." Adrian's response was chillingly precise. "I did not rely on algorithms. I deployed human assets to legally acquire her identity." "I required her to surrender personal information voluntarily," Adrian explained. Jessica's defensive perimeter tightened. "Are you aware of my prior incarceration?" she tested. "No," he replied, a satisfactory evasion. "I am transparent," he insisted. "I merely located her coordinates." "Proceed," Jessica instructed. "What is the economic engine of your existence?" "I manage familiar logistics," he stated. "Name 5 specific commodities," she challenged. Adrian produced a genuine, unfiltered smile, a rare breach in his stoic facade. "I must decline," he murmured. "That aligns with my hypothesis," she noted. Then he deployed his core directive. "I have never permitted a female subject to experience harm within any operational radius I control. A masterclass in grooming. Let us open the file on Adrian Voss. You and I are going to examine the anatomy of a megalomaniacal narcissist. Notice his opening gambit with the protective friend, Jessica. He claims he never takes what is not freely offered, a classic framing mechanism to establish absolute dominance under the guise of consent. When Jessica doubts his word, he does not become defensive. Instead, his voice drops. He explains that his word is his only currency. It is a calculated performance of vulnerability. The lesson here is quite simple. The most dangerous predators do not bare their teeth. They offer you a gentleman's promise. Notice the economic terms he uses to describe human life and trust. He tells Jessica that breaking his word costs him money and manpower. This is the sociopathic brain at work, reducing moral obligations to mere ledger entries. Jessica, attempting to hold her ground, agrees not to interfere, recognizing that Lena is an adult. Yet she lays down a strict boundary. If he hurts Lena, lies to her, or simply vanishes, there will be consequences. Jessica is trying to play a high-stakes psychological game with a master manipulator. It reminds us of a harsh truth. Setting boundaries with a narcissist is often just giving them a roadmap of your vulnerabilities. Here we see a fascinating rupture in Adrian's perfectly constructed facade. Jessica threatens to find his mother in Connecticut and expose the monster her son has become. For precisely half a second, the narcissist is genuinely destabilized. He actually laughs. It is a warm, surprised sound. He acknowledges that she has delivered the most effective threat he has heard in 15 years. Casually revealing his mother believes he works in real estate. This brief crack in his armor shows us something vital. Even the most hardened sociopaths compartmentalize their shame. We all hide our darkest truths from the people who first brought us into the world. Jessica departs, leaving Lena isolated with the apex predator. Lena immediately apologizes for her friend's hostility, but Adrian dismisses it. He claims it is refreshing to be threatened. This is a masterful pivot, framing himself as an enlightened, untouchable figure. When Lena finally laughs, a genuine release of tension, Adrian does not join her. He watches her in absolute stillness. Clinically speaking, he is not sharing a moment of joy. He is studying his prey, memorizing her micro-expressions, cataloging her emotional triggers. True connection requires mutual vulnerability, but a megalomaniac only seeks data to optimize his eventual control. The isolation phase begins. Adrian announces a sudden 5-day departure for what he vaguely terms a business matter. He is creating artificial scarcity, a textbook method to induce anxiety and dependence in the target. When Lena asks if the trip is dangerous, he evades, offering only a small white card with 10 digits. He commands her to use it only in an absolute emergency. He is planting a psychological seed of dread. He wants her to spend the next 5 days obsessing over his safety. The lesson is timeless. When someone makes you constantly fear for their survival, they are ensuring that you will never focus on your own well-being. He seals the psychological trap with a future promise. Having just flooded her nervous system with anxiety about his dangerous lifestyle, he immediately offers a reward dinner upon his return. He rationalizes his previous contradictory behavior, claiming that not wanting anything from her is different from wanting to sit across from her. Lena simply nods. When he walks away, she is paralyzed. She does not call her fiercely protective friend, nor her mother. She just sits with the cold coffee and the blank white card. Isolation is now complete. We see how quickly the mind can abandon its vital support systems when mesmerized by a dominant personality. 5 days of total silence. In behavioral conditioning, this is known as an intermittent reinforcement schedule. The white card sits on her counter, practically humming with manufactured tension. Then the trigger is pulled. At precisely 6:14 in the morning, her phone rings from the unlisted number. Her nervous system anticipates the crisis before her cognitive brain can even process it. An unfamiliar, gravelly voice informs her that a specific situation has arisen, just as Mr. Voss predicted. Her descent into trauma bonding accelerates here. We learn that waiting for a disaster is often far more psychologically damaging than the disaster itself. You and I must closely observe her reaction to the news. The anonymous handler confirms Adrian is injured but alive. He issues rapid, controlling commands. Be ready in 11 minutes. Bring only a phone. And critically, tell absolutely no one. Look, secrecy is the ultimate catalyst for Stockholm Syndrome. Lena sits on the edge of her bed, holding the disconnected phone, gripped by a terrifying clarity. She understands that stepping out of her door means crossing a threshold from which she will never return. It is a profound human tragedy. When we choose to walk into that darkness for someone else, we are choosing to leave our own light behind forever. She obeys without a single protest. She abandons her normal life, bypassing her phone and ignoring the impulse to call Jessica. Downstairs, she meets the handler, a hardened operative whose face reflects years of institutionalized violence. He opens the door to a dark, reinforced sedan. When the heavy door shuts, the muffled thud signals military-grade armor. Lena registers this detail, but asks 0 questions. The psychological submission is already manifesting. She is entering the physical and metaphorical prison of her captor's world. Sometimes, the most dangerous prisons do not have iron bars. They are built with our own willing compliance. In the sealed environment of the vehicle, She demands answers. The driver initially refuses, but then relents, validating her new elevated status in the syndicate's hierarchy. He explains that a meeting went poorly, resulting in bullet wounds to Adrian's shoulder and ribs. He emphasizes that they avoid hospitals, relying instead on underground medical care. The clincher is his final statement. Adrian has been asking for her since regaining consciousness. This feeds her savior complex, a crucial component of traumatic attachment. Being needed by a monster makes the victim feel uniquely powerful, masking the reality that they are entirely powerless. Her anxiety is peaking. She attempts a grounding technique her mother taught her during her father's terminal illness, counting her breaths. But clinical logic cannot override acute emotional hijacking. When they arrive at the undisclosed safe house, the driver issues a very specific instruction. He warns her that Adrian's appearance is grim and explicitly orders her to suppress any facial expression of horror. She is being trained to regulate her own emotional responses to suit the narcissist's ego. It is a haunting dynamic. When you are forced to swallow your own terror to protect someone else's pride, you have lost your autonomy entirely. The safe house operates with sterile sociopathic efficiency, armed guards, a covert physician, a silent housekeeper. They all treat Lena as an expected variable in this violent equation. Nobody demands her name because her identity has already been erased. She is now merely Adrian's possession. They lead her down a dim corridor to a standard bedroom serving as a makeshift trauma ward. Adrian lies pale and battered, his torso heavily bandaged, an ugly bruise flowering across his jaw. The environment is designed to maximize her sympathy. In the pathology of a megalomaniac, even physical weakness is weaponized to bind the caretaker closer to the source of the trauma. Let us dissect this reunion. A subordinate announces her arrival, and Adrian immediately deploys a classic double bind. He looks at her and simply says she should not have come, right? It forces Lena to declare her own willing participation. She sits on the bed and takes his hand, an instinctual gesture of comfort that seals her psychological entrapment. Adrian attempts to assert dominance by minimizing his trauma, joking that being alive and being all right are identical in his profession. Lena begs him not to joke. She believes she is comforting a wounded man. Failing to see, she is simply feeding a predator's insatiable need for absolute devotion. He finally provides the grim context. In a calm, detached voice, he outlines a 31-year blood feud with a rival syndicate, casually dismissing the violence as an inevitable cyclic dispute. He admits a miscalculation led to the bullet in his shoulder. But then, the megalomaniac plays his final card of the morning. Having completely destabilized her world and pulled her into his violent orbit, he suddenly orders her to leave. He commands her to go home immediately. It is the push-pull dynamic at its most aggressive. By pushing her away, he guarantees she will refuse to leave. The cruelest manipulators never trap you. They convince you to lock the door yourself. Let us examine the initial phase of their dynamic. Adrian Voss attempts the classic maneuver of the megalomaniac narcissist, the illusion of the noble release. He tells Lena that his driver, Frank, will take her away. He commands her to go home, to ignore his calls, to find some unremarkable office worker, marry him, and erase Adrian from her memory. He insists this is the warning he should have given her on night one, that he is a volatile entity surrounded by predators, and that loving him is a terminal condition. You and I have seen this pattern before. It is not an act of mercy. By explicitly detailing the mundane life she should accept, he guarantees she will reject it. He never meant to let her go. He only wanted her to choose the cage. Adrian admits his experiment failed. He wanted to see if he could desire a target without consuming it. He clinically concludes that a man of his pathology cannot simply want. His possession invites rival predators to seize his prize. Then comes the tactical break. His voice shatters. For Lena, seeing this apex predator display a fractured facade is intoxicating. He begs her to flee because he cannot bear to be her destruction. She observes his battered anatomy, the bandaged shoulder, the severe facial contusions, the chilling drop in his body temperature. This is the precise genesis of her Stockholm syndrome. The cognitive dissonance resolves into a singular, irrational clarity. Looking at her damaged captor, Lena decides the outside world is irrelevant. She refuses to leave. She verbalizes her dissent with disturbing calm. Adrian attempts a final protest, closing his eyes in feigned defeat. Lena announces her mandate. She is not retreating. She zeroes in on his physical needs, noting his dehydrated state, elevating herself to the role of his sole competent caretaker. She promises to retrieve water, anchor herself to the chair beside his mattress, and remain immobile until medical personnel return. She demands his verbal compliance. A calculated pause, and Adrian yields. Lena releases his grip, moves toward the exit, but halts at the threshold. Clinically, this is the moment the patient fully adopts the trauma bond as a shield. She refuses to face him, anchoring her hand on the doorframe, preparing to deliver her new, distorted manifesto. Her justification relies on a common coping mechanism, comparing a current dysfunction to a past trauma. She details the 7 years squandered on her former partner, Marcus, a corporate coward whose mundane betrayals left her deeply humiliated. She recounts running his trivial errands, fabricating lies for his family, and suffering in medical isolation while he engaged in infidelity. At 29, Lena declares an end to her subjugation. Ironically, she believes stepping into a violent syndicate is an act of total autonomy. She vows that any departure will be her own calculated choice, refusing to be dismissed for her supposed protection. Adrian simply agrees. The trap is now securely locked from the inside. She fetches the water, fully convinced of her own tragic sovereignty. Lena embeds herself in his environment for 48 hours. You and I have seen how these syndicate ecosystems adjust to absorb a new victim. The housekeeper, Marta, becomes a silent enabler, relocating Lena from the clinical bedside chair to a proper guest quarter at 3 in the morning. Marta feeds her, asks nothing, and offers a masterclass in behavioral conditioning, whispering that Adrian is a good man when permitted to be. Marta places the burden of his morality squarely on Lena's shoulders. We see this often in syndicate structures, the transfer of guilt to the newcomer. By day 3, medical clearance is granted. They travel back to the urban center in complete silence, their hands locked. Upon her return, her past collides with her new reality. Jessica is waiting. Jessica represents the baseline of normalcy. Lena is actively abandoning. The metrics of panic are clear. 11 missed calls, 27 messages, and an intervention staged with takeout food and defensive body language. Jessica demands a moral accounting. Once inside the apartment, the tension shatters. Lena collapses onto the upholstery and releases a brief 30-second auditory purge. It is not the loud grief she wasted on her previous partner. This is the physiological decompression of a subject who has sustained high-level trauma for consecutive days. The psychological weight simply breaks her posture. Jessica immediately abandons her adversarial stance, is shifting into the role of maternal protector and pulling Lena into a deep embrace. Lena provides a full confession. The clinical response from a healthy support system would be extraction, but Jessica's reaction is disturbingly pragmatic. A prolonged silence fills the room. Jessica mechanically plates the food, enforcing basic biological maintenance before verbal processing begins. After the meal, Jessica delivers a shocking psychological concession. She states plainly that she will not attempt an intervention. She admits to rehearsing every logical argument during Lena's absence, only to discard them all. Jessica has diagnosed the fundamental shift in her friend's neural pathways. The fragile woman from 2 weeks prior, the one weeping on the linoleum, has been eradicated. The trauma bond has forged a terrifying resilience, and Jessica recognizes the mutation. You and I know that enablers often disguise their surrender as unconditional support. Jessica issues her terms of compliance. First, she establishes a boundary regarding communication, threatening to involve Lena's mother in Baltimore if another vanishing act occurs. It is a weak perimeter, but it provides an illusion of control. Then comes the secondary condition, blind loyalty. Jessica traces their bond back to childhood, vowing allegiance regardless of the fallout. She explicitly maps out the catastrophic scenarios: criminal indictments, public scandals, or Lena arriving bruised with an infant a decade from now. It is a breathtaking display of pathological devotion. She provides a permanent safe harbor, which ironically accelerates Lena's descent into the dangerous world of Adrian Voss. Jessica covers the alternative outcome too, promising the same love if Lena somehow secures a perfectly mundane existence. The emotional dam breaks entirely, and Lena's auditory distress returns, loud and unfiltered. The verbal exchange concludes with an affirmation of their bond. Then the timeline accelerates. 3 weeks elapse. This is the incubation period. Adrian Voss undergoes physical rehabilitation while engaging in highly controlled social exposures. 2 dinners in undocumented, unmarked establishments, a sterile, calculated display of public affection, a brief contact on the mouth outside her residence on a Thursday, followed by an immediate tactical retreat. He maintains the power dynamic by dictating the exact parameters of their intimacy, keeping her perpetually starved. During this latency phase, the past officially severs itself. Her former abuser transmits a final text, signaling his permanent exit. Nature abhors a vacuum, and Lena's mind fabricates a dangerous delusion. She hypothesizes that the initial violence was an anomaly. She rationalizes that she can exist within the pull of a narcissistic kingpin without being crushed by the pressure. She believes the worst is over. But you and I know the truth about toxic cycles. The quietest days are usually just the eye of the storm. This cognitive distortion holds until the 22nd day. At 4:16 in the afternoon, the illusion shatters. While returning from a pharmacy run, an unidentified male intercepts her trajectory on the sidewalk. The hostile contact establishes physical control instantly by gripping her elbow. He issues a standard pacification script, instructing her to suppress her biological flight responses. Lena's reaction is surprisingly defiant. She demands the release of her arm. The operative escalates his psychological leverage. He reveals intimate surveillance data, pinpointing Adrian's exact current location at a dining establishment on 58th Street, proving his deep reconnaissance. He classifies himself as an independent contractor with a specific grievance against Voss. By isolating Lena as the sole communication conduit, he weaponizes her proximity to the target. She reiterates her demand for physical release. The operative complies, but crucially, He maintains his aggressive spatial dominance. Now we witness the deployment of collateral leverage. The operative outlines strict parameters for a Friday rendezvous. Adrian must arrive solo and clear his debts. If compliance fails, the operative threatens to relocate his intimidation tactics to Lena's mother in Baltimore. This data point triggers a severe autonomic nervous system response in Lena. Her vascular system constricts. She demands to know the extent of his intelligence gathering. The operative's reply is pure behavioral conditioning. He does not need to execute the violence. He only needs her to believe in his capacity for it. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? He vanishes, leaving her paralyzed on the pavement. She does not weep. She does not seek immediate rescue. The psychological paralysis is absolute. 60 seconds of total immobility. Lena uses this time to override her adrenal tremors, resetting her central nervous system. Rather than using digital communication to alert Jessica or Adrian, she physically transports herself into the epicenter of the danger. She secures transport to the 58th Street coordinates. Still clutching the mundane pharmacy bag, she breaches the perimeter of the exclusive restaurant at 4:31. Bypassing the host, she visually locks onto Adrian, who is conducting business with 2 associates. The moment he registers her micro-expressions, he initiates an immediate interception vector, rising to meet her. You and I have probably both made this mistake, running toward the fire, fully convinced our love is the one thing that can put it out. Today, you and I will open this case file together, looking past the romantic illusion into the pathology. Adrian, functioning as a classic megalomaniac narcissist, guides Lena from the restaurant. His gentle touch is a calculated, proprietary maneuver. She mechanically details the street encounter and the threats to her mother. Notice her blunted affect. She sheds no tears. The acute panic response has entirely burned out, leaving severe psychological dissociation. Adrian absorbs the threat to his perceived property. His face adopts a predatory stillness, a micro-expression she previously witnessed when he noticed the trauma marks on her wrist. It is a biological marker of impending aggression. Always remember that the most profound human violence rarely announces itself with a shout. It typically arrives in absolute terrifying silence. Lena monitors Hin's micro-expressions, a textbook hypervigilance typical of Stockholm Syndrome. She questions his move. Adrian initiates a systematic removal of her agency, heavily disguised as protective care. He dictates she is being relocated to Baltimore in exactly 1 hour. 2 of his associates will occupy her mother's home, controlling the perimeter indefinitely. This is pure territorial fortification. When she presses for the violent phase of his plan, he enforces a hard information blackout. He frames her face in his hands, utilizing an intimate physical restraint to establish profound dominance, and reminds her of his promise to keep her unharmed. We often mistake severe control for deep affection, failing to recognize that safety that absolute usually requires the complete surrender of one's personal freedom. Let us analyze this psychological pivot together. Adrian leverages his dominance by framing her compliance as an active choice. He instructs her to board the train and maintain complete ignorance regarding his impending violence. He creates a master illusion of free will, suggesting she can evaluate their dynamic later. But the traumatic bond is already cemented. Lena's cognitive dissonance resolves into full capitulation. She confesses her loyalty was secured on their second morning together, eating a simple breakfast provided by his staff. The captive has entirely aligned with the captor's reality, agreeing to flee to her mother. The lesson here is one of brutal human adaptation. The mind will aggressively rewrite its own survival instincts, transforming a dangerous predator into a perceived sanctuary just to survive the unbearable psychological strain. We witness the total calcification of her Stockholm syndrome. Lena pledges absolute loyalty, explicitly rejecting any return to normal society. She commits to his controlled environment, willfully ignoring his impending violence. This triggers a rare physiological response. The narcissist actually sheds tears. Whether this is genuine emotion or a subconscious manipulation tactic is debatable. Lena rationalizes her pathological choice by comparing him to a previous abuser, arguing that Adrian's self-awareness makes him an acceptable partner. For 5 straight days, his armed enforcers occupy her mother's living room, drinking coffee and addressing the older woman with polite deference. The mind is dangerously malleable. We frequently accept the most terrifying cages in life, provided the warden occasionally speaks to us with polite, respectful manners. The pathology quickly infects the family unit. By the 3rd day, her mother is baking pie for the enforcers, totally normalizing the grotesque captivity. Lena actively avoids Friday's news broadcasts, utilizing willful blindness to preserve her altered reality. Adrian's phone call is chillingly brief, and her eager command to be retrieved finalizes the transition. 1 year later, Lena stands in a luxury high-rise wearing a bespoke ring. The black sedan is on the street because the ultimate predator now sleeps in her bed. The man who once threatened her has simply ceased to exist, erased from the world without a single question asked. This is the clinical apex of cognitive dissonance. Profound moral decay rarely happens through sudden rebellion. It happens through silent, comfortable compromises made over a warm cup of morning coffee. We reach the conclusion of our case file. Her phone buzzes with a message from Adrian, a digital tether maintaining his perpetual surveillance, which she now warmly interprets as true love. She confirms she is home. This pathological bond stems from a single misdirected text message, blindly hooking a megalomaniac narcissist during a crisis. She genuinely believes this violent criminal is the most honest man she knows, demonstrating a profound diagnostic delusion. She embraces her life with a syndicate leader, convinced she made the choice with open eyes. You and I have evaluated the evidence together, and the clinical reality is stark. We love to tell ourselves we are making rational, empowered decisions, but unhealed psychological trauma often writes our script long before we ever step onto the stage. She will choose her beautiful cage every single time.